Welcome to another Learning Council podcast. This is your host, LeiLani Cawthon, CEO of Learning Council News Media and Research. And our topic of the day is unlocking minds, the power of creative reasoning in math education. So I'm super excited about this. I have my friend Nigel Nisbet with me, who's the Vice President of Content Creation from Mind Education. He leads a team of content specialists in building engaging, interactive, and completely visual games that teach students how math really works. And Nigel, you came to mind after working as a mathematics specialist in Los Angeles Unified, right?
I certainly did. Hi, LeiLani. Yes, I did. I taught in the classroom for many years here in LA and then worked at the district as a math expert for quite a while. And then actually about 15 years ago, in fact, I think it's 15 years ago this month because it's May, right? So
Yeah.
15 years ago this month, I came to Mind and I've been there ever since. So, yep.
Wow, that's a long tour of duty these days.
There you go. Well, I'm not
Yeah.
looking to go anywhere else anytime soon. So it's been fantastic and long may it
Yeah.
continue.
So suffice it to say, you've done the deed. You've been in the trenches, so you know what you're
Yes, yes,
talking
yes,
about. And
yes, yes.
I don't know as much as you know. So I'm going to dig right in here about like what are we saying? The power of creative reasoning. So where does creative reasoning belong in the learning process and really especially in math, right? Like it doesn't
I
seem intuitive
love
to me because
the
math is
tone
like
of your
numbers.
voice. I know, I love the tone of your voice. It's that almost sort of incredulity, like in math,
What?
it's
You
creative
know.
reasoning. And I think that, in essence, that is part of the issue here. So one of the little sort of there are so many little anecdotes that lead into this, but one of the key ones is a few years ago, obviously we had the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And my son at the time was in fourth grade, and we ended up working, sort of doing like an after school pod with a bunch of his friends, right? Sort of to kind of keep the kids on track. And so the parents all got to see their kids' math work much more closely than they'd ever seen it before because there's suddenly a whole lot more involved.
Yeah.
And every single one of these parents who knew that I did something mathy, but they weren't quite sure what, right?
Mhm.
Every single one of them asked me, why aren't they learning math the way that we used to? And they all were basically, they were looking at, area models for multiplication, going, why aren't they just learning the straight algorithm? Come on, it's numbers. Kind of like your point, like it's just numbers. Surely we just got to learn it, get the answer. And for them, math was answer getting. And this didn't matter whether they grew up in Armenia, Tibet, or even Glendale, California. They all had exactly the same kind of thing. Like, surely, look, we just need kids to be answer getters. Why aren't they just teaching them as quickly as possible to get to the algorithms, yada, 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 and do that? And there's so much to this, but one of the big things is that the world has changed, right? There was a time when being a good answer getter in mathematics actually had a point. Like it was actually pretty okay to be good at just getting answers for stuff. You could get a job for just being good at getting answers. That's no longer the case. And the
Yeah.
ability to use mathematics, to reason creatively, to understand how it works so you can use this system of sort to actually become a problem solver,
Mhm.
that's what's needed. And you don't get there by teaching kids to memorize procedures, right? You don't get kids to be creative thinkers and problem solvers by day in, day out, kind of just drilling them with, here's how to get this answer, here's how to get this answer, and then magically hoping at some point a light bulb goes off and suddenly they were able to sort of be creative problem solvers. That just isn't how it works. And if you look at our sort of system as it is at the moment, most kids, the majority of students are leaving school not proficient in math. I mean, the NAEP scores literally speak to that. They say about one third of kids are coming through really being proficient in mathematics, and they don't like it. They don't see it as engaging. They don't see it as exciting, and they don't see it as something particularly relevant to them. And that's a massive problem because here we have this incredible system, this incredible way of thinking about the world, this incredible way of analyzing things and solving problems. And it's a tool that sort of only a few people can use. And the the reality of the situation is that all kids are capable of unbelievable creative reasoning. They really are, especially when you sort of give kids problems early when they're sort of in kinder and first grade and get them to tackle things that they don't know how to do. They leap in, they go, yeah, I'll figure that out. And gradually we kind of unlearn them from that approach, right? We gradually sort of make them more and more afraid to try and do things that they don't know how to do until later on they basically get to the point, well, if no one's shown me how to do this, then I'm not even going to try. And that's the antithesis of what we need. What we need is an education system right now producing students who are looking at the very challenging problems that they are going to face, going, all right, I don't know how to do this, but I bet we can figure it out. And you don't get there by teaching them through procedural methodology, right? You get there
Yeah.
by building this love of figuring these things out, building this love of creative reasoning. So I would argue that creativity, creative reasoning, creative problem solving, A, has been at the heart of mathematics forever. We just
Mhm.
don't think of it like that
Mhm.
because of sort of the legacy of the last 100 years or so, the Industrial Revolution, this idea that we just need armies of people who can do things, almost like work like machines, right? That's kind of
Well,
been,
yeah.
our output from education was like, we just need people who can do these jobs, do these things. And that's no longer what we need. We have cell phones that are more powerful than sort of roomfuls of human computers. And what we
Yeah.
need now is students with the creative power to use these tools to solve problems. And
Well,
mathematics class is
but when you think
perfect for
about it,
building
when
that.
I think about math, math is a very flat subject. It doesn't have
Right.
the nuance of, say, French and a lot of other languages, because math is essentially a language, right? So it doesn't have it seems like it's hard code, right? It's like it's a one is a one, a two is
Ah,
a two, right? And so it's only when you get into the upper levels of mathematics where it seems like there's more creativity and problem
see,
solving and blah
now,
blah blah
now
blah.
that,
And maybe what we're doing is we're drilling that out of you, doing your addition worksheets hours
but
on end,
but I would
multiplication.
argue that that is actually part of the problem, that that is a misconception,
Oh,
right?
okay.
The point is that even with multiplication, let's say something like third grade multiplication, there are
Mhm.
so many ways to think about, to imagine, to creatively think about what multiplication is. It's repeated addition, it's multiplication. You can view it as an area model, you can think of it as an array, you can think of it as groups of objects. There are all of these sort of nuances, if you like, of ways of thinking about what multiplication is. The reason that in your mind you're like, oh, well, math is just this number, because you were taught to ignore all of those and go,
Yeah.
oh, it's just this number, do this.
Yeah,
So
I'm in agreement.
therefore,
Yeah.
your impression is that, oh, math is just this thing. And maybe at some later point, does it become really cool and interesting? And the other big thing is that in the past, the assumption was, only a few people needed to be able to do that creative reasoning. So if we're drilling it out of the rest of them, it doesn't really matter. It's okay. Like, oh, we only need one Einstein. We only need one of these people. And that's just no longer the case. It's like basically the ability to just do procedural mathematics without understanding what it is literally useless at this point. Like it's a totally useless skill. Doesn't mean the mathematics is useless, but far from it. But that approach to mathematics is completely useless. We need, and I think this is the other point, we can produce students who have a joy of problem solving, but it's no longer the province of a few. It's something that everybody can do, but it really speaks to how were you taught this? How did you engage in this learning process? And it's just so interesting that yes, your perspective is I think quite a common one. This idea, well, surely if we just drill the basics, then on top of the basics, we can add some other stuff and maybe it gets cool. And it's just the opposite of that. We need kids to experience that nuance. We need kids to experience firing up their creative power to figure stuff out from the
Mhm.
beginning, from kindergarten. And there is no reason why we can't do that. It's actually very doable. It just requires a real shift in mindset as to
Okay.
what learning is in mathematics, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so there's more to that. I'm going to pull out of you the neuroscience to it. So you just flipped the world upside down for me. And
Right?
there's got to be a reason. There's got to be a reason you're doing that. So I'm just going to ask you, is there science? Like, what are we saying? What did we find out? And I'm eager to know because I know you know.
So I think that you're right. There are definitely two angles to this, right? One of the reasons for the flip is that the world has changed. Nothing to do with how our brains work or anything like that, but literally the needs of now are different to the needs of 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah,
Like the
absolutely.
world has changed. The tools that we have available now are radically different from the tools that were available to prior generations. So therefore, the the sort of the needs coming out of education are different. But you're
Mhm.
absolutely right. We also, I think this is probably where the neuroscience has also shifted heavily. It used to be heavily believed that you were born with a very fixed amount of intelligence. Only a few people had a lot. Only a few people had enough to do this sort of creative reasoning. So if you think about, for example, Aldous Huxley's book Brave New World, where obviously it's not a parody, but it's sort of talking about the thinking of that era and it was exposing it as to how wrong it was. But it's talking about it's had this sort of classification of human beings as like, oh yeah, some people are this, some people are this, some people are this smart. And one of the things that neuroscience has shown through this sort of concept of neuroplasticity is the notion that no, actually, our brains are not fixed. We don't have this fixed amount of intelligence. We absolutely, given different circumstances, given different trainings, given different ways of experiencing the world, our brains are incredibly powerful and fluid and to a
And
large
elastic.
degree,
Don't they call that
yeah,
neuroelasticity?
yes, it's or neuroplasticity. Actually, this notion that, but yeah, basically, they can change. Our brains grow; they don't stop, right? They don't sort of um. We don't have to be stuck with this fixed limit. So, and obviously, there's plenty of people who've done all sorts of work. This sort of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. All of that work is very much pushing in this same direction, showing that, actually, when kids realize that they can think creatively. They can problem solve in ways they maybe hadn't thought of before. It's amazing. Suddenly you unlock this power within sort of all human beings are incredible learning machines. And certainly a lot of the neuroscience then of that machinery, if you like, it's universal. It's not something, some of the tools we talk a lot about the perception action cycle, some of these neuroscientific sort of mechanisms that we have in our brains. These are not things that only some people have. And certainly you're right in the sense that I think there's two threads that are really shifted. One, like I said, the thread of the outside need from what we need from education, and then also this shift of what our understanding is about human sort of brains and how they work and human intelligence, where it really was believed in the past that there was this sort of stratification of humans into some are this intelligent, some are not.
Well, we still do
And
that. We still do that with
we
the gifted
still
and
have,
talented.
so the legacies of those thinking are long and still very evident, right? We're
Yeah.
still, despite, I would say, for example, you mentioned how I used to be in Los Angeles Unified School District, and absolutely was. And LAUSD, like many school districts, has been pushing for decades to shift away from drill and kill style methodologies of teaching math and move into, sort of getting kids to reason more creatively in the classroom. So this this idea that we need to move is not new. I was heavily engaged in this while at LAUSD over 15 years ago, and even when I was in the classroom still. But my kids go to LAUSD schools today. And, so my son came home last week and basically he's in seventh grade doing Algebra 1 and mentioned that, oh yeah, we did, we're factoring polynomials right now. And I was like, oh, okay, that's, factoring polynomials is actually a wonderful, very interesting piece of mathematics working with quadratic equations. And I was like, oh, right, any area models, any visuals, any kind of stuff. And he's like, no, no, but they told us a rule. And I'm like, okay, oh gosh, okay, I know exactly
What's the
what that
rule?
rule is.
What's the rule?
It's basically, well, you draw this big X and you put the number in front, you put the middle number up here, and then, it's this whole way of basically proceduralizing solving this equation as though the only thing that's important or factoring this polynomial is getting the answer, and no understanding of what they're doing, no visualization of, oh, actually, this is a rectangle, it's an area, and what we're doing by finding the factors is finding the lengths of the sides of this sort of area. It's just that everything has X and it's a variable size. There's ways of thinking about this that really bring out understanding and connect back to multiplication in third grade. We were talking about how
Right.
multiplication in third grade has this nuance of area models, arrays. Same thing. Polynomials are basically just multiplication with all of the nuance, just with X's involved, right? And now we're just trying to say, oh, we know the product. Can we break it into its individual factors? Like 12, the number can be broken into 3 times 4. X squared plus 5x plus 6 can be broken into x plus 2 and x plus times x plus 3. So there's all sorts of coolness about this.
Right.
None. None. What's happening in the classroom last week was basically, here's this rule, learn it. And the funniest thing was the next day, so obviously I had a long discussion with him about this, probably more than he wanted to have. you know, um, but about, oh God, look, let's go through, and we looked at how this all worked and so forth and so on the way to soccer practice. Um, but then the next day he comes back and he's saying, you know what? Today they told us the rule that we learned yesterday doesn't work anymore. Now we have to do a new rule when there's a number in front of the x squared. And it's just like, oh my gosh,
Why? Why?
all of
Why are
that.
you doing that?
Why are you doing this? And the point being that you're absolutely right. The legacy of these things is long, right? The legacy of our thinking about how the human brain works lasts a long time. The legacy of our sort of industrialization, if you like, of education, it lasts a long time. And here we are, even 15 years after I left the school district and worked hard to try and shift the culture from within, in terms of specifically actually working with middle and high schools in terms of changing the way that they taught math. My son, who is now in middle school in seventh grade doing Algebra 1, is coming home showing that in this particular instance, really not a lot has changed. And
Mhm.
it's that's the shift. It
It's
it takes a long time.
baffling.
It takes a lot of effort. And it's not
I've
just
started to use the word encrusted.
right. And
I talk about a lot of schools. It's like there's a lot of encrusting going on.
there is, and
It's
it's not
encrusted.
it's not a blame
Um,
thing. It's just it's really hard to shift those mindsets. It just
well,
takes a
especially
long
if you think
time.
you've been successful,
Of
right? As a
course,
teacher
absolutely.
or as
Yeah,
a
yeah.
school, you're like, I got to get this done. I've got all these requirements. What do you mean I got to change everything? I'm not going to do it because now, because you're
It's
hitting me
so
from both
hard.
sides. I got requirements, I got state, testing.
Absolutely.
And on the other side, you're wanting me to be creative. Like I'm trying to run the ball down the middle so I don't get in trouble. That's, I think, what's really
Exactly.
going
And
on.
it's a
But
very, very tough thing. And of course, one of the big challenges is that teaching, where basically you're delivering rules, having kids practice those rules sort of over and over again and again, and then testing them on those rules, is much easier to fit within the time constraints of how long you have to actually make this occur than it
right.
is to throw it wide open, get them to engage in exploration, get them to engage in creative problem solving. And I think one of the key ideas for us at Mind, obviously, is we can make tools that actually make that transition a lot easier. So just like now we have
So
transformative tools, we
yeah.
can also have new tools in that transformation. And I think that's the new exciting piece for me, is that it's possible. Creative reasoning doesn't only have to be when a teacher totally changes everything about the way they teach. There are tools we can bring to bear now to help that transition. And I think that for me is the exciting part of sort of how to
I
help move
want
forward.
to, and I want to bring that out a little bit, right? So
Mhm.
let's talk about that. So you have this need to have creative reasoning. You've
Yeah.
got some issues here. We just talked about some of
Yep.
them. Like not only teachers are teaching in encrusted ways or old fashioned ways, but they kind of get only this little window. Like there's
Massively. Yeah.
grade
Very
five
tiny.
and
Yep.
everything that happened before that was already done
Yep.
wrong. And so now you're kind of screwed as a teacher. But let's talk about what kids are saying when they get into a way to do it, like your way, mind research is,
Right, right.
video-based learning, engaging UI,
I would say
user interface,
game-based learning, not video-based
game-based,
learning. Video
game-based
implies
learning.
passivity. It's very much
Okay.
about activity. Yes.
Okay. So game-based learning. So talk to me about that, because how does that then change the game,
Right,
like of
right. So
creativity?
great question. So
Okay.
one of the things is that inherently, and well, actually, obviously a lot depends upon the game design. You can have games that maybe don't drive that much creative thinking, but when you see kids, and I would say that what we really do is kind of puzzle-based learning, right? So it's kind of this notion that you're constantly solving a succession of puzzles. And first of all, we do that highly visually, so there's no language to get in the way. You're basically figuring things out. And this means from the get-go, from kindergarten onwards, students are put in a situation where they're looking at something, and initially they do not know how to solve the problem, right? So this is such a critical idea, that they're being confronted with something without sort of teacher guidance. And initially, kids, whatever age, in fact, but from kindergarten up, are looking at it going, I don't know.
Yeah.
And once they get used to this, their first instinct is not to raise their hand and go, oh, I don't know how to do this. Can somebody help me? Teacher, come and help me. Their first instinct becomes, once they've worked with this for a while, let me try, right? Let me
Yeah. Let me poke
try
around.
something.
Well,
And
they're
they
doing
poke
that now.
around.
Yeah, they're doing
Right,
that now on all their little iPads and mobile
right.
devices.
So,
Time they were
so,
too
so that's the
poking
point.
around.
They're used to this idea of basically poking around. Well, let me figure it out. Let me see if I can figure out what to do. And
Oh,
once, of course,
Nigel, I just got it. I just got it. What you're saying is when you put the mind in the position of not always asking for somebody, they're not,
right.
when the mind's in the position of not having to get a right answer,
Uh-huh.
they don't ask for a teacher, come here, I don't get it. Right. They're
Yes, and I mean,
going,
there
they
could
go into
still be a
exploratory mode and they poke around.
yes, and it could still be that a right answer is what's required. It's not a question that
Yeah.
there's not necessarily a right answer. It's just a question that the student will get used to this idea that that answer can come from inside them, right?
What I'm
And
saying is, let's say there's a worksheet in front of you.
right, right, yes.
It's a very flat thing.
It's
It's a
entirely
piece of
flat. It's
paper and a
entirely flat.
pencil,
Yep,
and it gives you a thing, and
yep,
then there's a
right.
space for the answer.
But yes,
So
yes,
what you're saying to me is the creativity in the system, it's dispensing itself differently, so that
yep.
then you're put into the position of not always having to go, I got to find the answer, right? Right.
Yep.
But I'm gonna just sort of open up, and
Yes. Yes. So
that's
so
a
so
different vibe.
you're getting very yes, you're getting something really fundamental and interesting here. The important thing is not the answer. The important thing is that the student engages in a process to find the answer, right? That and actually create the answer, which may be wrong. They may get it wrong repeatedly, but through repeatedly get it wrong, getting feedback on that, and then figuring out what's right, that process of not understanding and then coming to a place of understanding something, that process, doing that again and again and again and again, that is what builds basically powerful, what we call schema, like neural networks,
Yeah.
understanding, conceptual understanding of something. So the important point isn't just getting the out, like getting the answer would signify that you potentially understand what you're doing. But what we tend to do is we bypass the understanding and we give kids tricks as to how to get the answer, which then, of course, great, they can get the answer, but that's not the point. The
Yeah.
point is, do you understand what's going on? And as a result, the answer maybe signifies that you do, but the learning process can just be so completely different, where kids are engaged in that process of not knowing, productively struggling with trying to figure stuff out. And through that process, then coming to understand what's going on. And that process of actively being engaged in that figuring out, that actually builds learning, if that makes sense, right? That actually, like, what does not build learning is telling somebody how to do something and then just having them practice it over and over again. Very often that learning is shallow. It disappears really, really, really quickly. Like it dissipates, right? You forget it because you never had to have that moment yourself where you went, oh, I've got it now. Like those moments are gold, right? Those moments where you're kind of like, oh, I don't get this, but I'm going to try. And then
Mhm.
you figure it out. Those moments are like gold dust. They create tons of connections in your brain. They make your brain stronger. They make it sort of, the ideas become a web instead of this like a little list of separate
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah.
that sort of web is what enables you then to creatively solve bigger problems. And then your web becomes even stronger, which, it's this cumulative process. But the point being, it can begin in kindergarten. It's not something that has to wait until get kids like, oh, once you've passed calculus, then you can start being creative with mathematics. It's like, no, you can start being creative with mathematics from the very beginning. And
Mhm.
guess what? When you learn it like that all the way through, you are very much more likely to be creative with your mathematical thinking and problem solving as you get older. And I think the other big shift there is that it's not only a few people that are capable of doing that. Like the
Mhm. No,
vast majority
it's
of kids are
everybody.
capable of this type of problem solving. Um, and we can provide tools to help that to happen.
And you have to build their confidence. I think
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think when you're confident that it's just your playing field,
Yep.
that creates creativity. If you're not confident it's your playing field, you're sort of mannered. Like if you go to somebody's house where they make you take
Sure.
your shoes off at the front door, you're like,
Right.
oh my gosh, do I have my old socks on? If they have,
Yes. Yes.
are my toenails going to look okay? So you walk in and you're like, you're already in someone else's playing field. And I think that's really how we've taught math. But what you're
Mhm.
describing is this creative sort of nirvana where you're not inculcated into a disbelief in yourself in the first place,
Right.
which I think is
Yes.
half of
Yes.
what goes on in a lot of education. So let's go on to another part of this. I want to ask you about the characteristics of this type of learning. So,
Right. 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 Right.
what are those things that have to go on? Because I think if teachers and anybody listening to this podcast right now, if they can
Yeah.
just get those couple of main
What does it
things,
mean? What does it look like? Yeah. 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 Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
what am I doing? What
Yeah.
am I trying to create?
Yeah.
Right?
So that's an yeah, great question, a great point, and it's a good angle there because so the reason I left LAUSD, I'll tell you right now, is not because of anything that I didn't enjoy. I never thought I'd leave. I actually really loved what I did there. But I walked into a classroom 15 years and a couple of months ago, and I saw kids playing ST Math for the first time. I'd never heard of the program ever. And what I walked in and saw in a sixth grade classroom in South Central LA, I saw 42 kids in a computer lab. And sometimes you just walk in and you can tell kids are engaged, right? There's like a feeling, a buzz. And they were talking to each other, kind of like, and you could just sense this kind of they were engaged in productive struggle. And you could sense the sort of creative wheels to they were enjoying figuring things out, right? They were
Right.
engaged in that kind of, there was this active learning thing occurring. And as soon as I walked in and saw that happening at that scale in this particular classroom in a, tough school in South Central, I was like, oh my gosh, something really interesting is happening here. I had no idea what this thing was. Looked at the screen and saw a penguin, which certainly didn't make me go, oh yeah, right, this is because of the penguin. No, it's not that. But I saw then I saw what they were having to do, and I was like, oh my God, they're having to figure things out. And you could see, and I've been in plenty of other classrooms that nothing to do with ST Math, where teachers have created that kind of environment, right? Where you walk in and you can just sense the kids are buzzing. They're engaged in this problem solving. They're figuring things out. They're going, what are you
Yeah,
guys?
yeah,
And
yeah,
they're just
yeah, yeah,
engaged in
yeah,
that like they are wanting to
yeah.
figure out what's coming next. And just think how different that is from the sort of passive environment where kids are just sitting and listening to someone talking at them, kind of like what you were talking about, where they don't own the playing field. They're basically just being kind of told this stuff. It's the opposite of that. Like, it's a great way of putting it. If you walk into a room and you get the sense that the kids kind of own the playing field, something good is happening. I couldn't care
Yeah.
less whether it's using a game-based learning thing or it's a teacher using a task like, the 4-4s activity where kids have to use 4-4s with the different operations to make all the numbers from 1 to 20 or whatever. That type of thing works really well for these types of things. But you walk into classrooms and you see this type of stuff happening in all sorts of different places, but it's not happening consistently everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But it's that type of moment that is genuine learning. The kids are
Mhm.
engaged. They are the ones who are having those learning experiences, and as they're doing that, they're building their schema. They're really like their learning is kind of going off the charts. Um,
It's a joy. It's a
it's
joy
a
for
joy.
kids.
It's a joy.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
it's just as
It becomes a
wonderful to
joyful
behold.
process. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And for the kids too, they'd be like, well, my favorite subject is math. Why wouldn't it be? This is great, right? It's like this thing, which is so the antithesis, yes, of what you're sort of remembering, where it would be like, oh my God, no, that was awful. And
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be like that. It can be. Um, we can build tools to help that process. There are plenty of teachers who can make that process happen with the simplest of questions and suddenly make this joyous space occur. But it is much more difficult to teach in that manner than it
Yeah.
is to basically deliver information. But that's what it looks like. That's what it feels like. Kids are engaged. Kids are active. It's easy to get them to talk about what they do. Like, so one characteristic of it then, we talk about, academic discourse and the value. And academic discourse is hugely valuable. Getting kids to explain what's going on in their heads, getting them to discuss it, getting them to hear other people, hugely valuable thing. It is really hard to get kids to talk about something that they don't care about, right? It like,
Yeah. You don't want
if
to
you're
talk about it.
basically talking at students for like days and then going, okay, let's have a class discussion about this, it's no surprise that actually making that class discussion happen is almost impossible because the kids are just not used. They got no ownership. They
It's
got
been a
nothing. They want to talk
one-way
about it.
flow.
It's been a
Now
one-way
you're
flow. It's like,
asking them to,
why would they suddenly get interested in talking about it?
yeah.
Whereas if you'd had kids engaged in, that kind of activity, and then you were asking them, okay, so who wants to tell me about this? You couldn't shut them up. They'd be leaping out of themselves to tell you about what was going on and so forth and so
Yeah.
on. And we see that regularly then when, we go into classrooms and do puzzle talks where we'll take a puzzle, stick it up, have kids solve it and so forth, and then get them to explain about how they're solving it. And because they are the ones who've been doing the problem solving, they can't wait to tell you how they did it and what they did. And it's easy to get kids to talk about stuff when they're engaged, genuinely engaged in figuring things out. So I think that's
Right.
another of the characteristics that, hmm, is it easy for me to get the kids to talk about this? If not, then they're probably not getting enough ownership of the material of what's happening.
Yeah. And I want to comment on your ownership comment that when you're doing it individually on a screen, unlike a whole group where they're given their little worksheet,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And they got to sit there and do it on their own. When you're doing it on a screen and it's got animations and Gigi the penguin
Yes.
and things that move and stars and stripes and things that occur, right? It's a little bit different and engagement is very individual. It's not work, right? This is
Right.
work,
Right. Right.
right?
Right. Right. Doesn't
Right.
feel like work.
It
Yes.
doesn't feel
Yeah.
like work. It feels like you're playing a game and it's super awesome. Okay, so let's go to one other thing. What's changed in the world to make this an imperative, not
Right.
a nice to have,
No.
but an
No.
imperative? I want to say first, come on, people, every kind of AI just hit the game, right?
Hmm.
Voice AI, generative AI, spatial temporal AI, embedded IoT, Internet of Things, everything that you can imagine. As all these things come together, It's
Yep.
not the same world, and it's not flat. It's not flat and rote at all. So that's my first answer to that question,
Okay.
but I'm really posing it to you.
Yeah.
What's change and make this inevitable? Like not inevitable, but like
Imperative.
absolutely imperative.
Absolutely. Yes.
We have to do this right now, because if we don't do it, we may not have this generation graduate to jobs so that we get any social security. So,
Well,
that's my
so
take.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's I think there's multifacets to it. Two of which we were talking about before, right? One of which and one of which is connected to what you're talking about. AI is just the latest step in the development of technological tools that mean that basically, unless you as a human being are adding some creative dimension to what's occurring, like you're doing something uniquely human,
Yeah.
um, everything else is pretty much doable by a machine, right? Like I mean,
Right.
literally, I remember one of my son's friends being very excited about the fact that she was able to do her math homework by taking a photograph of it, using an app called Photomath, and then basically copying it out and putting it on the page. And that sort of stuff is only going to increase. And if the types of questions you're constantly being asked are solvable by photomath, then
Hmm.
you're really not being asked interesting questions, right? It's and of course,
Yeah.
I'm saying that that's actually the worst possible thing you could do, because you're not training your brain to do anything interesting at that point. But what has changed, obviously, yes, is tools have changed dramatically. The uh
Yeah.
the my mother had a job basically for most of her life by being absolutely brilliant, and I think being able to type at something like about 120 or 130 words per minute, which is, quite amazing. And that got her through most of her working career. And that is a skill which literally she would earn zero for today. And also, the notion that one skill is going to get you through a whole career these days is pretty much also long gone, right? So the new the critical skills become creativity, they become adaptability, flexibility, not being afraid to tackle new challenges, right? Even when you don't know what the answer is or you don't know where to go. So to meet those needs, you need a generation of kids who are basically trained and educated in that kind of environment where it's like,
Right.
yeah, I don't know how to do this, but I probably can figure it out. Great. And I have some tools to help me. Fantastic. Let's do that. And that's not what's happening at scale at the moment. There's a lot of other people pushing in this direction to try and help make it happen. Like I said, districts have been making really big efforts to try and do this, mostly through professional development. I think that's one of the challenges here, is that most districts see that their only tool to move the needle is through professional development. And I
And
think
that's not working
we're
anymore. And
saying,
they can't get
well,
the
it's a
teachers
piece of
anyway.
it.
So
It's a
yeah.
piece of it. I mean, doing it is better than not. But I think what we're saying is that that's no longer the only tool to help move the needle on this. We can build sort of game-based learning tools, other things that can also help to move that needle. But going back to your imperative question, the other thing is that future generations, and in fact, even this generation, and to some extent our generation, are also faced with sort of crises and challenges that the likes of which we haven't seen for millennia, that are going to hit in the relatively near future, also, which are problems that we do not currently know how to solve. So at a very
Right.
macro level, we've also got this, need for sort of a generation of kids to be very unafraid of not knowing, and very capable and confident of going, I think we can figure this out, because they're kind of going to have to. We're kind
Yeah.
of leaving them in a position. So there's a confluence of things. And just the third point here, we can't leave people out, right? Traditionally, education, and like I said, sort of there was such a view that, oh, only certain people needed to really use this kind of creative sort of
Yeah.
thing.
We bought into the bell curve and we never went
Right,
back.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
traditionally in the past, a lot of those people look very much like me. And there's no reason for that. And
No.
one of the wonderful, wonderful things about sort of, having worked now with STMath for 15 years, is we are in like schools all over the country, in all sorts of large urban districts and so forth and so on. I have been in classrooms where kids from every single conceivable background have leapt up and gone, oh my God, I just figured it out. And I don't, and
Yeah.
it is, we do not need to leave people out of this. And we can't leave behind vast proportions of the population. Like, oh, you're learning English. Well, that means you have to do this and you can, it's like, no, there's no reason for that whatsoever. We can
Yeah.
build tools that reach beyond those boundaries and those barriers. And we've already shown this is very, very possible with data at large scale, that like there's no reason for kids not to be able to do mathematics, do it well, and to do that kind of creative reasoning. So it's
Mhm.
imperative because tools are changing. It's imperative because we can't continue to leave out large chunks of the population. And
Right.
it's imperative because of the challenges that are looming in the not too distant future.
Excellent summary. Well, this has been amazing. I'm going to wrap up. I
Okay,
think that I would look forward to another conversation about
sure.
to delve deeper into the emotional outcome of that. Like
Mm,
when
mm,
you allow creativity to come into to the math learning,
right.
there's also an emotional outcome. There's a strengthening of the human side of the equation. So we're going beyond learning into
Yeah.
building humanity, which I think is another imperative, but we don't have time to talk about it right now.
That's
So
fine.
I love this conversation. I loved everything you said. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
This
LeiLani.
has been
Pleasure is
awesome.
absolutely.
So thank you for listening to another episode of Learning Council's podcast. This has been your host, LeiLani Cawthon. Keep listening, keep learning.